I believe so.
Okay. I feel like
for everyone being our guinea pigs for the first talk. Sorry about gonna be like this.
Oh man. We are live.
Great.
Sorry, it's coming out of multiple screens. It's really disorienting. Okay. We are live, and I'm going to, it might either be my view or your view, Peter. So I'm going to pin Lisa on mine. And I think we can get going.
Great. Well, if you don't mind, yeah, this is wonderful. Okay, well, welcome everyone here in the Zoom call and also on YouTube to zFestival's first guest artist talk with Lisa Bielawa. Lisa, thanks so much for being here. Lisa is a Rome Prize winner in musical composition and takes inspiration from her work from literary sources and a bunch of other artistic collaborations. Her work has been described as ruminative, pointillistic, and harmonically slightly tart by the New York Times. She's been spending a lot of time during quarantine on her project Broadcast from Home, which we'll be talking about a little bit more today, which is following a few other broadcasts in public spaces, including the Airfield broadcasts and the Mauer broadcast, which were both public performances, one in former airfields and one in memory of the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall last year. So yeah, without much further ado, Lisa Bielawa, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Shoshana and everybody. It's great to see you all. And hello, everybody on YouTube, wherever you are. So great. I am going to spend a little time today and I'll see how this goes. I think probably the best thing for me to do is to launch into the talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about my past work because of how it relates to Broadcast from Home. I'd like the focus to be on Broadcast from Home because it's what I'm doing now, and it's also going to be my continuing relationship with zFestival. But this is an opportunity for me to put that in context, a broader context of my other work. And I actually think that also is a helpful thing to discuss in these kinds of fora, because trying to find a way to contextualize the work that we're doing now as artists in the larger sphere of things is something that we're all trying to reach towards right now. So I'd like the discussion to kind of, help us with that, either together or separately. So yeah, that's where I'm going to start. As Peter mentioned, there were other broadcasts before Broadcast from Home. And these broadcasts, originally, the word broadcast I was using to mean sort of the pre-technological etymology of broadcast, which is to scatter in all directions. So when I started the broadcast series, I was working on Airfield Broadcast, which is a series, which so far a couple, maybe there will be more, of large-scale works written for hundreds of musical performers, which included professionals, amateurs, and students on former airfields that are now public parks. And the idea was to sort of reclaim these spaces that were once wartime spaces and reclaim them for the urban life of the city. And I would have all the groups start at the center of the space. And then gradually over the course of an hour-long performance, they get further and further away from each other. So that if you're an audience member, you walk around and you just you get to be your own mixing engineer, because what you want to hear is, you can determine what you hear by where you bike or walk. And eventually at the end of the piece, it's actually not possible to hear everybody at the same time. So this led me to lots of fulfilling relationships with various parks departments in various countries. And I learned a lot about wind direction and, and sound. But before I get into that, and I'm going to show you a little bit of that, my fascination with sort of bringing our music practice into a more sort of socially active space and more activist space, and more what they call social practice, I guess, which I didn't realize I was a social practice artist until the social practice artists found me and said, "You're a social practice artist." I was like, great. Social practice meaning artists who make work with the actual organic and very integrated participation of the people who encounter the work, so that the audience, performer, the wall between audience and performer is actually is porous, and the actual building of the work happens with the active participation of others. This practice started, and I'm so excited that Christina Berger is on this Zoom call, because Christina commissioned me to write a piece for her chorus, Curator, back in 2004. And I was, at the time, I think it wasn't my first, but it was one of the first pieces that I wrote that used sort of overheard, that used sort of current events, kind of overheard text. It was a setting of the Lamentations of Jeremiah that integrated also into the texture. It integrated news streams that, this was back in the early days of the interweb, right? But I was in Italy at an artist colony, and I was going on the computer every day there and seeing the news come in during the Gulf Wars. And it just seemed like this sort of, this incredible Lamentations of Jeremiah is all about just the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, and just the resonance of that was too powerful to ignore. So I remember, Christina, that I was working on the piece already, and then I went there, and suddenly this news started happening, and I threw out all the work I had done on the piece already, and I completely rewrote the piece in a very, very short time, intensely, because of what had happened, because of what was happening in the world. And I integrated these words into the piece. The piece is called Lamentations for a City, and I'm not going to play it now, but if you go to my website, you can actually hear, there are links there, so you can hear this superb performance that Curator did on one of my own recordings on Tzaddik. That piece was an early example. A few years later, I did a piece called Chance Encounter, where I wrote a piece for the Knights, an orchestra of the Knights, and soprano Susan Naruki, who's now on the faculty at UC San Diego. And this piece, Chance Encounter, was a setting, it was a piece for chamber orchestra and soprano that was performed in transient public space. It was done all over the world, but we premiered it in Seward Park in Lower Manhattan. And it was designed to be performed in public space, and all the words that she was singing were things that I had overheard in transient public space. So the idea was that she was sort of filtering the sort of thoughts of people in that, and it was really fun. I mean, I would be on subway platforms, and I had performers texting me stuff they overheard that I integrated too. And it was really lively, because as I was working, I was having all of these various sort of stuff that people overheard coming in, and I organized those into Chance Encounter has 5 sections, and they had to do a sort of, I organized them into categories of mood. So one of them is called Topos Nostalgia, because people say very nostalgic things when they're out in public space. They're like, oh, my father lost his job and we never go here anymore. There used to be a place here that, there used to be trees, So people say stuff like that, or they say stuff like, there's one section called Drama Self-Pity, because people are always spewing out sort of drama when they're in public space, like, oh, it's always when I'm waiting for the train that it gets stuck, and I'm, people have a very elevated sense of their own relationship with the city when they're in it. So I just, these are the sort of these arias had kind of came together, congealed from the sort of commonality of these various overheard fragments. That was in 2007. So then, that particular piece, Chance Encounter, ended up being performed at the Venice Architectural Biennale, and in Rome, and in Vancouver. And so it got a lot of performances in public space, and it sort of got me into this sort of public space, activated kind of work. But it was, of course, always with professionals, and or with the group that rehearsed it. There was the audience and that came upon it. And I started getting interested in 2012, 11, 12 in expanding this idea of public space performance pieces in such a way that more of the community that would encounter it would also be part of it. So I started working on a piece, this airfield broadcast piece. The first iteration of it was in Berlin, called Tempelhof. broadcast because there's the Tempelhof airfield, which is now a public park. And it was inspired because the Tempelhof airfield, like the weekend it opened, I happened to be visiting Berlin. And I was like, oh, this is amazing. And I could hear a dog bark from like 500 meters away. I thought, oh man, it would be awesome if there was like bands. And so I ended up having, what I did was I put out a wide call and I wanted to get as many different groups, whether they were traditional music groups or whether they were choirs or whatever. I didn't really care what they were. All I really wanted people to do was an administrative audition. Like I can write for you at any level as long as you can actually show up and do the thing. So I ended up having 250 participants there, which came from 9 different groups in Berlin. And we did, the piece was around 50 minutes long and we performed it multiple times on the Tempelhof airfield. But while I was working on it, I was spending a lot of time out in San Francisco, which is where I'm from. And in order to work on this piece, because it's very hard to work on pieces that are going to be performed in vast spaces if you're in a room with a piano and your headset or whatever. This is what we're all encountering now, trying to protect the sort of expansiveness and loftiness of our work while we're in these little Zoom pods. So I would take long walks at Crissy Field in San Francisco just to get a sense of scope, of scale. And one morning I was walking out there and there were, I think, 11 different foghorns happening at the same time. It was just absolutely gorgeous. And I was like, oh man, this is great. So I went back to my little Airbnb and I wrote them all down. And I talked to a friend there. She's like, Crissy Field was also formerly an airfield, and now it's a public park. You should totally do it here. So I did that. I got it together. It was only 5 months after, they were both in 2013. And in San Francisco, I got 800 people. And it was a huge, huge endeavor. These were professional musicians and amateur groups. I had the amateur group that was associated with the San Francisco Symphony. They had an amateur music program that participated. There were student groups. There was a group of Chinese instrument ensembles. So I had to learn how to write for all these Chinese instruments. There was my own middle school band, which sounded like you'd think that one's own public middle school band might sound. But again, it was an administrative audition. And so I wrote a part for a band that sounds just like that so they could do their job. The San Francisco Girls Chorus, which I had just taken over as artistic director, they were also involved. So I actually thought it'd be kind of fun because it would give some context to share with you like a little bit of an overview, a sort of a little short video demonstration of Crissy broadcast from San Francisco, and you can get a sense for what that was like. So his video is, I don't know, 3 minutes long or something like that. So here we go. kids are great. So that was 2013. Boy, it's amazing to see that many people in one place, isn't it? Makes me both happy and sad at the same time. So that was an incredibly fulfilling experience, also an enormous amount of work. And one of the things that I discovered was how how exciting it was for me to bring together these different factions of musical life into one project. And I kind of got addicted to using, to sort of reaching out to amateurs as well as students. And I see there's a question about the rain contingency. I'm going to answer that right away because it's interesting. When I was trying to get this project off the ground in Berlin, every time I talked to anybody about it, they're like, what if it rains? And I was like, oh, right, sorry, let's cancel. You know, it's like the difference between, what's the difference between an American standing on a street corner and a German standing on a street corner, right? The American is waiting for something good to happen. Berliners, I love them. So the answer is, we always, with Chance Encounter and with this piece too, we always scheduled 2 or 3 different, actually 3 or 4 different performance times and days, so that if one of them got rained out, it was always on one of them got rained out. It did rain in Berlin, and so the string instruments were not called, but you know, a lot of the players just were determined to finish the piece, so they went forward. But they were also both scheduled at times. You know, I consulted with the Parks Department, and you know, I always scheduled these pieces at times that were weather friendly, so that it was less likely to have a rain out. We had that with Chance Encounter also in Rome. There was a nearby bridge and everybody just kind of waited under the bridge until it cleared up, and then we just continued the performance. So, you know, this is how it had to be. So thanks for Shoshana for that question. So these were very fulfilling projects, and I developed a lot of relationships with these different groups. Then I started kind of going in a different direction because I ended up having a residency. I was artist in residence with this group called the Grand Central Arts Center in Southern California. And this was their new chief curator there was somebody who had seen Chance Encounter and years earlier and really wanted to bring me out there. It's basically kind of a social practice oriented arts center that's not really about music. He wasn't a music guy, so it wasn't a music presenter. It was an arts gallery and arts presenter. So he brought me out there, and my job was to figure out a way to partner with other arts organizations in the region and make work that would build community in Southern California. And as it turns out, we went to go see an airfield down there, and I thought maybe I would kind of continue in the same direction. But what ended up happening was a little different. When I was in college, I actually didn't major in music. I majored in French literature in college. This is related, just stay with me here, it's a tangent. But when I was in college, I did a senior essay in the literature major that was all about the experiences of teenage girl visionaries throughout the centuries in Western history and the groups of men around them, whether those men were priests or neurologists or the surrealists who were also weirdly fascinated with teenage girls, that they used to give absinthe in bars and make them do automatic poetry. There were a lot of writings that were technically collaborative writings by groups of men that were writing about the experiences of these teenage girls whose actual words were oddly missing from all these studies. So I actually did my whole senior essay on this figure of this young girl throughout history and how it's, in fact, like across all of these disciplines, she still was there, just sort of at the center, like having her visions. And I did an enormous amount of research on this. And when I first came to New York, I finished the essay and I got an A, and then it just like went on a shelf. And I felt like I was sort of emotionally not finished with her. So I'm going to check the chat to see if there are other questions. Actually, maybe Shoshana or Peter, you can let me know if there's like just, if there's a question that is time sensitive that comes up. I see there's some that may need to be interrupted to talk to answer now, but some of them can be later. I met shortly after I graduated from college in my 20s. I met a playwright whose writing I fell in love with, and he had done a lot of work that had the kind of feeling of it that I felt was right for this. So I actually gave him all my research, and this was before email. This is 1994. I sent him a box, of like all this research that I did, and he read it all. And several months later, an entire opera libretto like showed up in my mailbox called Vireo, the Spiritual Biography of a Witch's Accuser. And it was one girl who lived in multiple centuries at the same time, having these experiences. And there was another character, the doctor, who was sometimes a doctor, but then mysteriously he was sometimes a priest, because like that's how he was. And so he and I started working on this, and I started sending sort of work tape recordings to every opera company in the entire country, but nobody knew who I was. And basically like I couldn't get a single answer from anybody. Like, how are you going to be? I was a woman. Nobody was doing operas by women then anyway. So I sent these things all over the place, and I got absolutely no interest in this thing. Zero interest in my opera. So I said to Eric, you know what? I just think maybe nobody knows who I am. Maybe I should start with like a string quartet or something. I think I have to I can't do this project. I can't start with an opera. It's just not going to work. So I put the piece on a shelf for 20 years and always knew it was there. And then I was there in Southern California at this arts, center. And one of the places that he took me to meet some folks was the Orange County School of the Arts, where they had a classical voice department with all these teenage girls who were really beautifully trained. And I just walked in there and I felt like I was in a room full of vireos. And then another meeting I had was, and what I started to slowly learn was, this was Southern California. The really innovative, collaborative people there were in television. And so I went and met folks at KCET, which was at that point, the largest independent television station in the nation. And they were totally into it. So I said, well, why don't I make an opera that's a TV series that's also a streaming series? So we created this opera that actually was intended to be streamed. And you can see the whole thing now. It's on KCET's website. And people who are missing going to the opera are really, it's suddenly now, oddly enough, a couple of years later, because it was released in 2017. It's getting a huge sort of resurgence of interest now because of the fact that it's an entire opera that was actually made to be binge watched on your, on your screen. So as I did this project, of course, I wanted to bring some of the values that I had been, this sort of working with a large range of sort of bringing community together through the project and finding ways to work with young people, students, and amateurs. And so I ended up, the piece over the course of 2 years, I had to raise money as we went. So I was only able to shoot a couple episodes at a time. And it took 2 years, during which time my leading lady went from 16 to 18 years old and grew enormously. And so what this meant is that as she was maturing vocally, I could actually write the role. I was able to write the role for her as she was developing as an artist, which was just amazing to me. And there was halfway through the opera, Vireo hatches a twin of herself. Suddenly there are two of her. And one of them is not actually having real visions, but just likes the attention she's getting from the doctors and sees that she can kind of get ahead in the world if she pretends she has visions. And so these two girls suddenly for the last half of the opera are there's this energy between them. And the actress, the singer that I cast in that role was only 14 at that time. And just now, as we speak, she was sent home from her freshman year at Harvard. She wasn't able to finish her freshman year at Harvard. But she's, these girls are still, this is pretty recent, and they're still young women who are, it was incredible working with them all. And I had all 125 girls from the various levels of the San Francisco Girls Chorus involved. And I'm going to play you a little bit of episode 11, which is the sort of the climactic. It's a 12 episode series, and episode 11 is really the climax. Episode 12 is kind of the, sort of the coda. But episode 11 was shot on Inauguration Day, 2017, in Oakland, California, where there were riots outside, and it was storming rain, just a deluge. And we had rented the since condemned 16th Street Oakland train station that had no plumbing and no electricity. And we wired the whole thing. We had it for just the one day. And what we did was we shot the whole thing 3 times through from beginning to end with one camera guy who was on, we always did it this way, who had a kind of a, what do you call it, a Steadicam, right? And I would conduct, although in this episode I needed 2 other conductors as well, because the room was huge and we had to stay together and it was sound. All the sound is captured on site. There was no overdubbing, because anybody who's seen Mozart in the Jungle knows that we can tell if it's not, actually. So all the playing and all the singing is happening as you see it. Deborah Voigt got wind of it. She wanted to be in it. So we turned ourselves upside down and wrote her a role. We made her the Queen of Sweden. I don't know, like whatever, we put the Queen of Sweden in there. But the scene is that Virio is being taken to a sort of a surgical circus, because that's the word they used for it. The demonstration, the circus, where they used to demonstrate. Large groups of men would watch as hysterical girls were manipulated into having fits. And there are photographs of this. This is very disturbing stuff. They gave her morphine. So the scene just before this, episode 10, if you have a chance to see it, has Lorelei, wonderful vocal group, and they are the absolutely terrifying assistants who are injecting her with morphine in this gnarly scene. But then she has this sort of experience where she's, she and her counterpart are they the same person? Are they different? She and Caroline, her twin, are being pressured to, they've gotten a lot of power in the world because they're naming witches, and everybody's getting killed, and they have this power to name witches, and anybody that they name gets killed. And Caroline's drunk on the power. So then they name each other as witches, basically, in this scene that you're gonna see. But what I decided to do is, because it's a circus scene, there was always an audience there when we did these shoots. There was always a live audience there who would have to sign a thing saying, I'm going to be on TV just for watching, right? Like a studio audience. We always had a studio audience. But in this case, I reached out to the same group that had done the Chrissy broadcast, and we told them what to wear. And I gave them little sheets of music in advance. They signed up, and I gave them a little sheet of music in advance saying, okay, I found out what they played. Somebody played melodica. I'm like, okay, whatever. And I'd make a little melody, and I'd say to them, okay, learn and memorize this melody and bring your instrument and come at this time and wear blue or red. And so there was no rehearsal, just come, it had to be composed so that, when I pointed to them and they did their thing, that was their thing. So you're not going to hear much of that in this, but you will see in this segment, you'll see in the audience that people just sitting there with a bass or a saxophone, and they're holding instruments, because there were times in the action when the audience came alive with just with noise. So the episode is 23 minutes long, so I'm not going to be able to share a lot of it, but I encourage you, maybe I can give a link afterwards, but I encourage you to go check it out, because these girls in particular are just tremendously talented, and it's really inspiring. So this is, a segment of, it looks like it's a 5-minute segment or so of episode 11 of Virio. Well, I have to make sure that I always forget to make sure. Yes, share computer sound. Here we go.
I hate the world because it is around me. I hate the world because it moved me. I hate the world because I love the world and would leave it to hold it. Most of all, the doctor and Raphael and my mother are witches because they are around me. I see them every day.
Cried the dragon, celestial surgeon, expiring in ash and shard.
The lions and tigers and elephants are all worms, and they kiss the flesh from your bones. Many witches I've known all along you were a witch. Do you wanna do this? 30,000 die hanging on flames. Do you wanna do this? Do you wanna die, you crazy woman? Name Caroline. Name Virion. Name Caroline. Name Virion. Name Caroline. Name Virion.
So I encourage you, like, go and check it out. So it's 23 minutes long, that episode, but man, what performances. And these girls, as you can see, I mean, just like they were 15 and 17 when we did that, those girls. And, it just to a person, I mean, the fact that we were involved in this sort of 18-hour day, that was also inauguration day, but this is what we were doing. We were hanging out with 125 girls and doing this. This is how they were going to remember that day. And that makes me feel very, very great. So this was a really important project for me, as you can imagine. It took 5 years, but it was funny because the necessities of sort of fundraising and the whatever created this structure whereby I was making it episodic work that was actually following. I mean, it was, the girls were growing up, you could see them growing up. And so in fact, it made the piece sort of follow the times. And it wasn't just like, you create episodes and like you release the whole season at once, you shoot the whole season at once, like you do with some TV. I mean, we were shooting it. And the fact that we were shooting it in the order as things developed, as things unfolded, changed the way the piece as a whole turned out, right? And that's something that's very important that came forward into Broadcast from Home. And I'm going to pivot a little bit now. I'm going to fast forward to the last, however many months starting in the fall. I'm wondering if there are any questions that I should address now before I sort of move forward. We're kind of at a good point.
There was one about the airfield pieces.
Yeah.
Seamus wanted to ask what level of detail were the parts notated or synchronized, and what was the motivation for like the level of specificity that you chose for it?
That's a really good question. And in fact, I would say, Seamus, that's such a good question that in fact, you're already, it's prescient, your question, because the answer to that question will be answered later when we look at the parts for Broadcast from Home. The answer in general is, what I do is I make, in the case of airfields, there are real-time notations, like this has to happen by 5 minutes, right? Generally, there are these, these sort of real-time points at which things change. And there's one person per group who's actually needs to make sure that their clock or their timepiece is aligned with the atomic clock. And I send around a link with the atomic clock so that everybody's, because not all cell phones are exactly, so the timekeeper in each group has to be, like that. But in terms of synchronization, for the same reason that I don't require anybody participating in my projects now to be like singing along with a click track or trying to line their voices up with other people in a choral, whatever. Thank you, Christina. Christina knows because she sang in chapter 8. It's important to me to make sure that we're still making music and that we're not trying to squeeze ourselves into a sad box. That's just my philosophy. And so out on the airfield too, it's not because we're in our little boxes and have to, whatever, it's because out on the airfield in real space, it's just impossible to hear certain things. And it's only going to be frustrating if you don't just sort of embrace the space. So the units, the way that I use aleatoric material so that it can develop and certain things happen, according to certain times, they're also because I didn't want people with music stands out there. So the instructions and the sort of, it was the interaction of different kinds of material and the way, giving instructions with material so that it would result in in sort of variety, and also in developing, in actual shapes, things that developed. That was the challenge. You have to create cells, little plastic pieces of musical information that when they fit together actually combine in a way that creates something that has an arc to it. So that's kind of the general answer. And we'll be looking a little more closely at what that means for broadcast from home later, because it's a similar philosophy for different reasons, actually. Great. Are there other questions before I sort of charge forward? Here's this last one from Lily. How often does your aleatoric material surprise you, or does it usually come out as you envisioned? That's a very good question. And well, I'm going to answer that directly. Surprise me, not anymore, because I have held back anymore at actually even understanding or anticipating what the key to making work like this is that you absolutely must not have some fantasy of control beyond a certain point. It's going to turn out better if you know to control the parameters, but not to try to control the outcome. You have to be able to create materials that, so there isn't a way that I envisioned. Broadcast from home, for example, I do maybe 40% of the composing in advance when I throw the phrases up there for people to sing and play. Most of the composing process happens after I actually get the performances back. And we'll talk about that a little later, but it's not even necessarily an experience of surprise. It's more just a constant, steady state of uncertainty that one has to be comfortable with. You have to understand that, like, what you're dealing with is stuff that won't. There can't be an ideal and a fulfillment. There has to be just an impulse to give information that intuitively will be able to come together in such a way that can be compelling later. So yeah, cool. Anything else that I missed here that I see favorite authors, and maybe that's something I can get to at the end, because I want to make sure that I get through to the, but these great questions that are coming up here.
I have like a little bit of a question about the episodic, like the concept of an episodic work.
Form.
And yeah, and like I guess you kind of explained how you got into that, but and how it's different. I don't know, I guess how that works and how that works for like an audience, because I mean we saw like everybody's like, I want to see what happens next, which I imagine is a big part of the episodic format. And like, I guess what's different about it other than what you've already said? Yeah, I just think it's a very cool concept, and I want you to talk about it more.
Yeah, I mean, the question of whether or not there's artifice, I mean, we all want to know what's going to happen next in our world right now. But the piece I'm creating now, like, it's not like I know. I'm not creating cliffhangers because of my craftiness. We're living in a world of cliffhangers, and so I'm just partnering us through that. And I think for me, the episodic form is a way to stay current, is a way to stay, to partner more closely with the audience and with those who are making the work with me. It's just to stay authentic to the moment that we're in. And in the case of Vireo, I was staying authentic with the moment, with the growth of these young women, and to some degree also staying authentic with the times. I mean, it wasn't like we didn't realize that we were doing this on Inauguration Day. That's the day it was available. Probably that's why, but we were aware. I mean, things changed politically over the course of that time, and sort of in our world between 2015, 2017. Of course, that influenced what we were making. And, if you want to do large scale work, which takes time to do, but you also want to be responsive to the times, then the episodic format is perfect, because you can create something large, but you can be responsive to the world as you make it, So that's, I don't know, hope that's an answer. I think that's an answer.
Yeah,
cool.
No, that's great. That's cool.
So I'd like to kind of stumble forward here, unless there's anything else that seems like it's really based in stuff I already covered. only. I think it's safe to move forward, yeah? So I want to talk a little bit about one last project that was just on the cusp of our now. I started working with an artist named Cheryl Oring, and she has she's a social practice artist, and she's an installation artist, sort of a performance artist, and she has a project called I Wish to Say, where she's been doing this since 2004. And she sits out there in like 60s clothing, like Mad Men outfits with old typewriters that are all colorful and manual typewriters in public space. And she offers to type people's postcards to the president or the next president. And she's been doing this since 2004. And so she has amassed around 3,000 postcards to the president. As it turns out, so she and I met through the Creative Capital Foundation, which supported Chance Encounter. I was doing Chance Encounter, which was all these overheard texts, and she was doing postcards for the president. And we sort of became friends, and then we got back in touch. We always wanted to work together. So we had a sort of an explosion of ways to work together this last year, which has been really wonderful. One of them was that I created a piece with the postcards to the president called Voter's Litany. And that piece was going to be premiered at the National Cathedral, a huge symphonic choral work that was going to be premiered on March 22nd of this year. So of course it was canceled. However, what I've done is I've changed that, and this is something we can talk about later. I've changed that to, she and I are now working on a piece called Voters Broadcast, which is going to be entirely online, where she's going to continue as we lead up to the election, and we're going to work on voter registration, and we'll be partnering with the University of Michigan and Wayne State, where there was going to be a debate, but now there's not, but they're still going to do all kinds of democracy and debate programming. So I am going to be working with that music and with those postcards in this other form, starting like beginning of September. So that's something that's super exciting. But Cheryl also is bilingual, and she like me, she has made big work in Berlin before. So for the 25th anniversary of the Fall of the Wall, which was 31 years ago, she was commissioned to do a typing thing where she would set up in her outfit with her typewriters, German typewriters, and type people's memories of the wall. It turns out then that what happened was this last year, the city of Berlin was doing the 30th anniversary celebrations of the Fall of the Wall. And so we pitched this project idea to them, and they commissioned a piece called Mauer Broadcast, where I actually set those memories of the Fall of the Wall from the 25th anniversary for the 30th anniversary. And it was performed 5 times over the course of that week, in the first week in November. And the thing that was important and new about this project, and I'm not going to play things for you because I don't actually really have, I sort of don't really have a way to do that. But I'd like to show you this page. This is the Mauer Broadcast Learning Tool. This is something that I made for the first time. It's a way to kind of get further into involving amateurs. What I did was my friend Greg Pernhagen and I, whom some of you know, we recorded all of the choir parts. I made an easy choir and an intermediate choir. Then there are some solos and duets. And this is the English page, but there's a German page also that has everything in German. And anybody who wanted to could come to a sing-in, right, where they could actually, a sing-in is basically a rehearsal that's like a rehearsal for the public. Or you could just come to performance. And what you do is you go here and you listen to the teaching tracks and you look at the text sheet. There's no music. There's no like score, because the idea was that it's for anybody. They don't have to be able to read music. You learn it. You know, if people wanted scores, they would write to me and I'd send them scores. But people could just go here and learn and have a text sheet and learn to sing these parts. And then they could just come and be in it. And this is sort of how it sounded all together. So this is the first time, this is back in, whatever, a little less than a year ago, the first time that I actually used this idea of having an online teaching tracks for people to learn parts so that then they could be part of the performance. And there were some parts of the piece that were actually so, they were like call and response like. Choir 1 was very call and response like. So it was even possible for us to, with passersby, to get them to come in and join the performance as, as we were doing it, which did happen, which was great. So this was a really exciting, and I had some professionals in there to kind of anchor it, and it was just sort of like that. But it was a way to kind of open up the process at every stage to participation at whatever level people wanted to participate. And we were looking at doing voters broadcast in the same way. That was actually going to happen. The plan was for that piece to happen at the Brooklyn Public Library there at Grand Army Plaza in front of and that was going to happen a couple months from now with voter registration and all that kind of stuff. That, of course, is not going to be able to happen either. But as we were sort of plunged into lockdown in March, I was in the middle of a week at the Stone. I had an entire week long festival at the Stone, which is John Zorn's venue in New York that was canceled. And I was just getting started on voters broadcast in the public space. Plus, I was supposed to be touring all over the world with the Philip Glass Ensemble and with various other of my own pieces, and all of that got canceled. Everything was canceled. Everything was canceled. Tens of thousands of dollars of work canceled, plus work that I had other people I was hiring for and companies that I founded to make projects that had purchased $20,000 of plane tickets. I get off this call with you all and I'm going to go stand in line, wait in line, on the phone with Orbitz yet again to try to get them to give me refunds. This is our lives now. Some of you are shaking your heads. So this is sort of the world we were suddenly in. And I had a financial crisis. I also lived by myself. I had a personal situation. I was like, wow, there's nobody. Suddenly, my lifestyle is usually like work at home a lot, and then travel around the world with people and be, doing shoots like with Furio and being around people. And suddenly I was thrust back into my own space with myself, everything canceled. I was teaching. There were I was supposed to coach some chamber musicians. How is that going to happen? I had a bunch of students that I was, and people that I was supposed to create projects with in the next few months, various educational and arts presenters. Suddenly their programming couldn't happen. So this is sort of the background. I don't need to tell you how this happens, but this is the background. And I'm going to go now to this screen. I'm actually not supposed to be showing you this part yet. I'm supposed to be showing you my talk overview. So this is basically me thinking. This is my inner voice. Okay, this is me at the end of March. What happened? Who are my communities? What do they need? There's students I'm supposed to be working with who are like with their cello in their house, or they're in a quarantine hotel in China with their cello or whatever. Educators, other people, they're trying to find ways to make coursework. Musicians have lost work, including myself. Choral singers, big one, especially a little bit later than late March, right? Lost their singing outlet and suddenly it's dangerous to sing with people. People in my community who are experiencing grief. I live a block away from the hospital. And I was, saw the tents go up. I saw the trucks. Every day when we would go at 7 p.m. to bang our pots, it was to thank, medical workers who were right there in front of my house. Music lovers and audiences lost live performance experiences, some of whom are supporters. I have a friend on this call, for example, who was, who has supported work. What if they were going to be supporting projects of mine that were suddenly canceled, right? I have people who had already given money to projects of mine that can't happen now. Organizations, people worldwide who want an outlet to share their experiences, people like me who are in lockdown in London who live by themselves and they are isolated, people who want to learn what others are experiencing in other parts of the world. And then of course there was this idea that in fact, there are cultural institutions who are trying to archive the impact of the crisis on individual people and communities. So these are the communities that sort of guided my thinking and made me create this project. And I'm going to describe how it works now, and then we're going to go back and take a look at some specific things. This is the website, and I encourage you to visit the website because, of course, it's where everything lives. This is the Broadcast from Home website. And the first thing you'll notice is it describes what it is, but here's a link. I'm collecting your testimonies. no matter where you are in the world, I want to hear from you about what your personal experiences during this time of pandemic and global activism. This was added later. Guess what? The world has changed since I started this project. That was true of Vireo as well. Your voices, like Mauer broadcast, it was possible to join by listening to tracks here and sing. And what I've done basically is, I'm going to go speed down to the bottom here. These are the teaching tracks. Now they have scores there. These are the teaching tracks. You can just go there, and if you want to contribute your voice, you can just sing these things and load them up from your phone and put them in, in the page. You link on the thing, you send me their thing, boom, I have recordings of you singing these phrases. These phrases are settings of testimonies that have come in that previous week. So, these are words that people have, the testimonies of people who have just sent me. So, and I make one of these every single week. We also have had prompts. Here are the testimonies. You can see there are over 100 testimonies, 110 testimonies. This is the map. I don't know, it's looking a little bit, here we go. You can see I've gotten testimonies and vocal recordings from all over the world. I've gotten around 300 submissions over the course of the project. And as you can see, I finished the first chapter the first week of April. So I've actually been doing this every week since the beginning of this, since almost the beginning of this crisis. And every week it's a different vibe. I'm going to play you a little bit of excerpts from some of them. As you can see, here's chapter 13. This went up just on Thursday. I'm working on chapter 14 right now, which will go up in 3 days. Chapter 13, doesn't need a whole lot of introduction because it's pretty much an expression of how angry and frightened people are in the US. And you could take a listen to that and see where we are now. These chapters this process of collecting testimonies and turning them around and creating something every week from them. The way that works is I get the testimonies in, I take a look at them basically on Wednesday mornings. I look at all the testimonies that have come in. Like with Chance Encounter, I sort of try to glean which ones are resonant with each other. But instead of something like drama, self-pity, I'm like looking at the fact that it's grief this week, or now we're losing track of time, or now we're protesting racial injustice. And now what is it that's happening in the world right now this week? What are people sending me? What are people telling me? And then by Thursday morning, I will have written phrases, melodic phrases for vocal phrases, and I will have sung them myself. And Greg Pernhagen will sing, he's a baritone, he will have sung the men's phrases, and those go up on the website. Later that day, the finished chapter from the week before also goes up. So the phrases for next week and the finished chapter from last week go up on the same day on Thursday. Thursday, I begin writing instrumental phrases, that little pieces that will go along with those vocal phrases for the chapter coming up. I meet with the musicians. We talk about sort of, hey, do you have a piccolo? Oh, you're a percussionist. What do you have at home? Do you have a vibraphone at your house, or what do you have? These kinds of things. Oh, you have a melodica. Is it a 3-octave melodica? I just find out those kinds of things. And then I create the parts, hopefully by the end of the day Friday. Sometimes it takes me a little longer. Over the course of the weekend, and of course, all this time, because the general public can be sending in their vocal recordings. So I'm already getting vocal recordings for chapter 14 now, since Thursday when it went up. The individual musicians the instrumentalists upload their recordings by noon on Monday. So I just got those today. When I get off this call with you, I'm gonna hit it, because starting halfway through Monday and then basically all day Tuesday, and that's usually an 18 to 20 hour day, Tuesday. I often work from 5 in the morning to 1 in the morning on Tuesday. And that's when all the composing happens. Everything gets dumped into Pro Tools, and I create it by editing it in I've never done this before. Compose it entirely in Pro Tools using the little fragments that I composed, on Wednesday through Friday. And again, like with airfield broadcasts, those fragments have to be, obviously they have to be thought out. I mean, it can't be just random. I I have to know that I'm creating little pieces of stuff that I know will work together, but I don't actually think, okay, I'm going to make them work this way together. I just know that they will work together. They have to have that plastic, that flexibility to them. And so I'm going to show you what some of this looks like, and we're going to listen to a few of these. One of the things that happened, I've been learning a lot as we go. One of the things that I do every week now, that started with week 3, is I always give another chance in the vocal phrases for people to add their own sort of instant testimonies inside the actual phrases. So I noticed that in week 3, this is like at the height of the crisis in New York, you know, you would have thought that there would be, I mean, week 2 was incredibly sad, and I had lost somebody. So that, you know, chapter 2 was dedicated to this friend of mine that had died of the virus, and people were losing people. But week 3, what I noticed was that people were actually disgruntled, and they were like snapping at each other. Like they were complaining to me, you know, careless people in their 20s and 30s aren't wearing masks, and they aren't, you know, standing far enough away. And my neighbor has a different woman home every night. And so these were coming up in the testimonies. So I invited, for the first time in the phrases that you saw online, I invited people to add their own disgruntled phrases. I said, you know, on any note, you know, sing your disgruntled phrase. And then there was also a testimony where someone was saying, I don't want to like watch a concert on a screen, and I don't want to like meet you for happy hour online. I want to sit across from you, next to you, you know, behind you, in front of you. I want to sit with you. So the frustration of that was coming out. Also, I was experiencing every night at 7 p.m. the sort of this letting off of steam that we had. And I'm going to share, before I play you half of chapter 3, I'm going to play you what that was like here in my neighborhood. So this is 7 p.m., April 19th, Washington Heights, block from the hospital. So that was my fire escape. Chapter 3 was the first time that I used field audio, and I've used field audio a few times since then. I used field audio of 7 p.m. again, actually 5 weeks later, and this is the one, Christina, that you participated in. I used field audio because it actually sounded quite different. I mean, we've been, you know, we still do it here. We've been doing it for over 3.5 months. But the field audio sounded different. You know, it's something that's changing as we go. So I wanted to, that energy combined with the energy of various people's gripes about, you know, that was sort of the kind of the feeling of chapter 3. And I think it's possible that Jim Rosenfield is also on this call. He had one of the testimonies from this particular chapter, which is kind of great. So you'll be hearing his words. This is, so this is going to be like the second half of chapter 3. I know you're just sort of looking at my various things here, but there's nothing to look at here. So here is the second half of chapter 3.
Looks like themselves right now. What if this is our new normal forever?
Careless people in their 20s and 30s aren't wearing masks and won't stand far enough away.
Everyone wants to go back to normal. There's a normal
wasting. My neighbor has a... Why are people hoarding and wasting? Careless people in their 20s and 30s aren't wearing masks and won't stand far enough away. Across from you. Next to you. Behind you. Next to you.
from you. Next to you. Behind you. In front of you.
So that was part of the chapter where I first learned that people need to be able to amplify their vocal contributions by also adding testimony of their own. I want to show you, I'm going to go back to Acrobat here for a second. I'd like to show you what one of the parts looks like for that. So this is the percussion part. You heard him at the end there. This is what I told him. Using these pitches, create blurt-like fast phrases, right? Gradually make them longer. So this is, a really good example, a way to Seamus, answer your question from earlier. This is I'm giving pitches, so I know it's going to work. And I know that I want the energy to escalate. I didn't exactly know how. I just wanted to have material that would enable me to go that way. This is a 10th grader in the Face the Music program. I just told him to hit stuff. I don't know what he has at home. I had all the players yell, across from you, bam, and just do stuff with their instruments. There's other stuff there that I thought, okay, these building blocks, these chords are going to be useful to me. I don't know what he has. Contrasting household objects. I don't know. See what you got. Wind chimes, rain stick. What do you have? So this is the kind of material. This is basically a part for those of you who are interested in participating. This is kind of what a part looks like, with some stuff that's just little pod-like material and other stuff that's kind of open. And there's always an invitation to show me stuff. I don't know. And so I'm going to play you a little bit of chapter 4 now, just because this is sort of when I was sort of learning how to do this. Another thing that I learned was we are all at home here. When we play chamber music or sing in a chamber setting, we have an opportunity to tune, with string players, especially, and just chamber musicians, tuning to each other all the time, constantly responding to each other. And of course, we can't do that now. But the last thing I want is for people to be playing their violin, like trying to like sing, play along and, with a Zoom thing. So I determined that, and also I don't want people lining up with a thing and trying to play in the same rhythm. So I decided that what I could do is I could create a forward propulsive energy, right, by having radically different tempos and just making people just create tempos in a really broad range and just send me all that stuff. And then I'd see what happy accidents transpired, So people play rhythmically with themselves. And then also I started to do a lot of double stops with string players, because then they can tune to themselves. And then you get two notes that happen at the same time because they're happening with the same person. So this is the kind of thing that I started to do. I'm going to show you, actually, before playing this one, I'm going to show you some of chapter 4. Here is an example. I tell the player, play any Adagio, Andante, or Largo. Play any of these tempos. Use any tempo in this range above, but just be super steady. And it's all these pitches. And then what I did was, for the first time, and I do this every week now, one player, and it's usually a cello or a bass if I have a bass, or a horn if I don't have any strings, they are the tuning track player. So this player uploaded his own tuning track, this stuff first. And what I tell the other players is, okay, go online, don't record anything till you listen to the tuning track, but listen to the tuning track while you're like making a salad or something. Just like listen to it a few times, so the same way that when you walk out of a concert, it's still going through your mind. That just sort of gives you the tonal center, the tuning center in your body. And then close the laptop, sit down, with your instrument and just play, Same with metronome marking. Give you a metronome marking. Okay, listen to the metronome marking like you would in a rehearsal, but then put it away and just play. And I'll handle it on this end then. I'll just do whatever I need to do. So, it gives me a little bit of, gives me a little bit of control of things like intonation and sort of propulsive motion, rhythmic propulsion, but it doesn't require the players to be sort of enslaved to a matrix that requires synchronization, which I don't want to do. So here is a little bit of chapter 4. And chapter 4 was people were starting to painfully miss things, especially sort of hugging other people. And I mean, it's hard to imagine that we were missing that already in chapter 4, because I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm missing it terribly now. But this excerpt of chapter 4 is notable because it uses this technique of having the propulsive, the different strings within different tempi, but also because it had a testimony from Africa, from Nairobi. A woman wrote in that she would love to walk across town to the market with her friends and haggle over prices and then hug them goodbye. And I love the idea that the individual pictures of what we're doing with our time may differ from culture to culture, but this sense of missing that touch was universal, and that was what I was hearing, and what people were missing is what I was hearing. Yeah. So, and as it turns out, a chorus in Florida found me this week. This was like the University of South Florida. I don't know where they heard the NPR thing or what. Suddenly I had 55 singers at this thing. So it was like the Robert Shaw chapter. So here's a little bit of chapter 4. So you can hear, you can hear all of these. They're all around 3 to 5 minutes long. A couple of them are a little longer than 5 minutes, but that was sort of almost all of the second half of chapter 4. I'm just going to play one more chapter now in its entirety because it's a sort of a special one that kind of touches on a lot of the things that we've been talking about. While I was working on chapter 9, which had testimonies from May 23rd and 24th, which was before the death of George Floyd. And I was working on, it turns out that even creating these every week was not fast enough to keep up with what was happening. So I did something which was, and of course, after I'd already uploaded the phrases, I started getting testimonies like this. And I got a beautiful testimony from a 15-year-old young Black man who lives in Brooklyn. And I just thought, okay, well, I'm going to have to just reach out to friends who are saying, whatever, I have to include this. I've got to pivot, you know, and I reached out to the musicians. I was like, okay, it's different. Everything's different. Play this now. You know, basically it was like rewrote everything. I used the testimonies from before because actually they had, you know, stuff is in the air. I mean, the feelings were in the air. So it turned out that it worked. The new testimony worked with what was already there. But I also had friends at the protests in both Minneapolis and in New York. And so while I was working, I had them sending, like while I was working, I was getting, I'll show you, I was getting text messages, a video like this. Where is it? Here it is. So, you know, like that. I dumped them all in, ripped the audio, put it in the, you know, in Pro Tools while I was working. And since there had already been, you know, sort of a field audio component, it totally changed what happened in chapter 9. So I just wanted to show you a little bit. I can show you a part, I think, from chapter 9 too, before I play you the, do I have a part? Yeah, here's some of chapter 9. Again, I had sort of created this material that could work at any tempo. I gave players different tempos here and just, you know, little pieces of material. This is mostly just so you can see what it is. So I'm going to play chapter 9 in its entirety. It's around 3.5 minutes long. And then I think I'm going to, you know, I think at this point it's good to kind of just wrap up and leave some time for questions. But here's chapter 9. It's called Hear Me, Hear Me, Hear Me. And the text is by an anonymous 15-year-old who sent me a testimony from Brooklyn.
Recall the pretty
We have several testimony contributors on this, I'm aware, on this Zoom call. So thank you for your words. It's really... So this takes us to 9. I just finished 13. 13 is, I considered playing it, but I recommend you take a listen to it. It also uses field audio. 13 uses the sound of the fireworks that have been happening every single night, pretty much all night while I've been working. And it's just something that's been happening, in our cities. And it's, in social practice, they call this kind of work radical listening. So it's been an amazing experience just here alone in my apartment to hear people singing, hear people's voices, the sort of the grain of their voices coming in from all over the world, to read these testimonies. Now there are 108 of them, I think. It's a tremendous way to stay connected, during this time. So. Questions? No questions.
No questions.
No questions.
Do you want to maybe talk a little bit more specifically about like the way the week will look for us, for people who are interested?
Sure.
And then maybe I imagine there'll be questions about that.
Sure. No problem. So basically what happens is people who sing, and everybody's invited to sing, anybody in the world is invited to sing, can access the phrases on Thursday morning, Thursday midday. They will become available. So that's this coming Thursday. And there is basically singers, because they include the general public. I can integrate vocal recordings that come in all the way to the end of Tuesday, although it's nice if they come in on Monday, because it's a lot of work integrating them. So that's a more relaxed cycle. I create the instrumental parts expressly for whatever instrumentalists sign up, right? That's you guys. So however many of you sign up for that. And those parts get cranked out somehow, like between Thursday, all the day Friday. Most people, especially the person who has to play the tuning track, which would be decided in advance, that person certainly would have their part by the end of the day on Friday. Everybody else would have their parts probably by the end of the day on Friday, but sometimes I need until halfway through Saturday to finish the parts. Those go up, and you saw what the parts are. It's basically a page, maybe a page and a half most, of just individual phrases that don't have to line up with anything. You just play, upload. Cell phone's fine, or if you have a nicer setup, that's great. And those get uploaded to me at a Google Drive link that's dedicated, that I circulate, that's just for the instrumentalists who participate. I ask for the instrumental tracks to come in by Monday at noon. So that means, 48 hours or 2.5 days that you get with that material to turn it around. And then what happens is, as I work on it, because most of the composing process, of course, happens then, and also in case anything happens in the world that that needs to be integrated, Monday and Tuesday are days when I might be reaching out, say, hey, violinists out there, is there anybody who can give me like a tremolo, like Sul Pont, for around 4 seconds on an open D? That'd be really handy. And people say, oh, sorry, I have a thing, or, oh, I can do it after, 3:00 p.m. Is that early? So I'm basically in constant email contact with the players from pretty much all weekend. I mean, if you have questions, as you're looking at it, you'll find if you email me your questions, I usually get back to you in like a minute because I'm right here. And then, the sort of willingness, it's not a do or die, but the willingness of enough people to be kind of on hand also, and possibly responsive to emails from me to record a little extra stuff on Tuesday is, through the end of Tuesday is good. Wednesday, by Wednesday morning, I'm already done, and it's at the engineer. So the engineer does the mixing and mastering, and then on Thursday, usually by end of Wednesday, I'll be able to send it as an MP3 to people who made it, sort of a sneak peek. But then Thursday, in this particular case, it's going to be 7:30 p.m. Thursday. There's a Guggenheim Works in Process show it's going to be unveiled there. So there's actually going to be a formal kind of an actual the presenter this week on Thursday, July 16th, where the chapter will be unveiled, as well as a film that's been made by the filmmaker Anthony Hawley. He's working on a film of Chapter 4 that uses footage of New York around, the last however many weeks. So that's the shape of it. It's a pretty tight little process. Yeah. Did I cover it all? I think so. Yeah. Favorite authors. Right now, I'm reading Death and the American Civil War. I know, but it's really beautiful. Drew Gilpin Faust. She's up at Harvard Radcliffe. I love Rachel Cusk. I'm a huge fan of Proust. I read a lot. There's 3,000 books in my house. I'm a fan of literary criticism, which is sort of a weird thing to be a fan of these days, but I really am a fan of it. I love cutting my teeth on that. Yeah, I see some questions here. Great, Christina, let's be in touch. I have community look like in more rural areas. Yeah, from Alex. I'd say listen to chapter 6, because chapter 6 was there's a rural community in California somewhere. The testimony, one of the main testimonies came from that area, a woman who's 79 years old, talking about how it feels to be in a rural area as they sort of waited. So chapter 6 would have been May, second week of May, as they sort of waited for the virus to come to their part of the world and how that felt. One of the lines that she wrote is, "We are dangerously old." The sense of just kind of being in a rural community where it hadn't come yet. So it is there. It's in the testimonies. You're right. A lot of the work here has been in more heavily populated areas, but has to do with, it has to do with what I presented today. So it's all there. But I also respond to what comes in on the testimonies. The testimonies sort of determine. I've gotten, there have been some from rural areas of Australia where they don't even really have any, firsthand, they basically, the virus hasn't even come there. They've had 2 cases in their whole county. And they've contributed also to say, like, wow, this is amazing that this is happening in our world. Here, we're like, it's this other way. So yeah, I think, the density of testimonies that have come in from urban areas has everything to do with the fact that that's where the energy was coming from during the protests, certainly. And also the fact that that there was a lot of stuff coming from New York at the very, very beginning, but then there was stuff coming from London. There were things coming in from Brazil. Yeah, I hope that helps. Yeah, I don't know if I actually answered what my vision of community looks like in more rural areas. And I don't know, I've never lived in a rural area, but I did try to honor that, the fact that there was participation in the process coming from areas that, from all different kinds of areas, and not just the ones that I'm most familiar with. So hope that's helpful.
Hi, Lisa. I'm wondering if you could touch on the editing process in Pro Tools, the composing, as you call it.
Yeah, sure.
Do you cut out a lot of audio from the clips that you get submitted in, or do you use most of it that's sent to you?
I use 100% of people who submit. It's not, it really depends. If somebody has a particularly tender and wonderful, if you listen to chapter 8, you'll hear a line that Christina sang so beautifully that I just had her do it herself. But then other people sort of followed. So sometimes somebody will be the sort of, I feel like, wow, that's like the way, that's the line, There've been a couple cases where someone sings the line wrong, so I can't use them with everyone else. So they become a soloist. You actually heard an example of that in chapter 4. She was like totally on the wrong notes. So she had to become the soloist. which I love. It's sort of upside down from the way we think of music making in the world. But yeah, I mean, I think the sense that I'm going to show you, I'm going to try to show you a little bit of, here's chapter 11 edit final. I'll show you a Pro Tools thing, just because you guys are probably, there are some geeks who will enjoy this kind of thing. So this is I'm going to have to put them in micro, ignore, micro. So there are many, many tracks, as you can see. These are all the tracks. This is 2 of me. I always give myself 2 tracks because I might sing a duet with myself. I sing everything, or I might need to add something later. Here are all the people who just sent in. This is just people who contributed their voices, and I use their names. Sometimes I say these are sopranos. Cindy was sort of doing some soprano and alto. I don't know what she was up to. These are all the people who contribute. So from down to here is just voices, right? And then I have the players that I was working with. I had a trumpet. I had a couple of violins. I have 4 violins, a guitar. I had an electric guitar, a percussion. And so you can see that this is the clean version. At this point, I've thrown out everything that I don't use. But you can see that I really do. Sometimes the voices sing together. Here's these people all singing this phrase together. They more or less line up. If they don't, I sort of craftily kind of sneak them in. I don't see an example of that. But sometimes what I do is if somebody, like here, it looks like David, I left out the first word because maybe he didn't sing it enough at the same time as everybody. So then he gets in on the second word. You know, things like that. I just find ways to kind of adapt to the fact that people are here. This is a really good example. I'm sure this is an example of where this person, because I can see the long fade, this person probably made this particular last couple of words sound really rich and full, but he probably was either on totally the wrong notes or maybe singing in a totally different rhythm than everybody else in a way that wasn't working. Sometimes it works. So I sort of brought him in a little later. Things like that. It's a very, but a lot of times, oh, here's a big old thing where everybody's together. It's really about just sort of figuring out which lines feel compelling together and which ones just, are more poignant or more direct if they're sung by somebody who particularly nailed it. I don't know. Does that make sense? Kind of. Yeah. Oh, mix window. I have a question about the mix window. Yeah, the mix window is left to the engineer. I mean, I do the panning sometimes, but I don't always do the panning. I basically finish the editing. Like I do the very fine, there's absolutely no editing left when it goes to the engineer, but the engineer does all of the, and I even also, the reason that I don't necessarily think you need to see the mix window is that I do deal with balances, but I do it by using the level faders on the clips themselves so that I get it, I get it to be balanced. By the time I send it to the engineer, it pretty much sounds the way I want it to sound, except that everybody's sort of dry and like that. So I see another great question from Andrew. Yes, I do see this. I mean, this is the kind of project I was starting to do, like with the Mauer broadcast. This is definitely the way that I was starting to do projects in the physical world. And this was a really effective way to build community that wasn't already there, but it also was a unique moment. I mean, we're already actually not in this moment anymore. Now we're in a situation where, for example, chapter 13 was a specifically American feeling. Even the protests were not a specifically American, uniquely American moment, whereas the frustration that a lot of people are feeling right now has to do with, in other words, the virus has now started to become politicized. And so as a result, the testimonies are coming in more fragmented. And this sort of resonance between different parts of the world that I felt, whether even if it was through grief or sort of shock, anger, all these kinds of things, that universal resonance has started to fragment already. So I wouldn't take the credit for building community. I tapped into a sort of a moment, an organic moment that was unprecedented, really, but tragic in the way in which it was unprecedented. So we'll see, Loving the comments. Thank you. Are there other questions in there I might have missed?
I don't think there's any more questions. If anyone has anything else, I would say speak up now. Otherwise, we'll probably shut down the YouTube live cast and take a short break before going into. Oh,
Christina has a question.
Christina has a question.
Yeah, this is not. I'm curious, Lisa, because I've seen several responses to our current situation, several compositional responses, musical responses to our isolation that I find they're just boring to me, and attempts to create community that I think are facile or experiments, compositional and sonic and engineering experiments that worked once, but will be the same thing every time they get tried. And I mean, I sympathize with anybody trying to figure out how to do new music and new composing and new musical experiences in these limitations. And I'm going to write to you privately about why I'm practically on the edge of tears about why everything that you've done is so valuable and ingenious. And I'm just merely curious, do you have a sense for yourself, being in the middle of this, I think it's an amazing project. Do you wonder, like, then what? Like, what if the limitations remain the same and I have to figure out something else interesting and ingenious and valuable and helpful? Like, where do you go from here? It's like when I read Toni Morrison's Beloved, I'm like, well, how the fuck does anybody write anything else after that? She or anybody? You know, like, what do you ask yourself that question, or you're not preoccupying yourself with it? Like, what does it feel like?
Yeah, I mean, I have like 6 answers to that question. I'll give you 2. One of them is that I am going to be shifting my focus to voters broadcasts because I'm interested in getting people to vote.
Yeah.
And so there is, in a way that's so different because it's not as much about ministering to, to at some point, I'm going to have to, I'm only one person. So in order to fulfill that, and I'm working with the presidential debate committee on that, even though there's no debate, but the money for programming around the debate is still there. So I'm still going to be able to, you know what I'm saying? Right? I mean, and I'm still going to be working on getting people to participate in that way. And that's something that I think is, I mean, we're in a more reactive time now, right? We're entering into a more reactive chapter of the crisis. This is something that Jim, you and I were talking about on the phone the other day too. And, the role that this project has played, no matter what. Yeah, of course I have separation anxiety. Among other things, this project has kept me alive. I mean, I'm here by myself. Don't even get me started on touch starvation. I mean, the hearing the grain of people's voices and hearing bodies on instruments. I mean, part of the reason I don't want anyone leaning towards a click track is because I want to hear people's bodies play, because I don't have anybody touching me. I don't have any I don't have any kinetic energy here in my living room unless it comes from these performances. And so, but I do think that I felt that way with Vireo too. You throw yourself into something 100% and then you have to live with the consequences of the fact that, that time moves forward in one direction. And, I'm tired too. I'm exhausted, there's that. I mean, but this is just about the beauty of the ephemeral too. Do you know what I mean? I hear chapter 4 and I think, well, I can't write a chapter like that again. It's not even just, about the project itself. It's about each week I feel that. I hear chapter 9 and I think, the innocence and of that moment when everybody felt like they were on this, we were all there together pushing, pulling for this one thing. Those moments come and then they move in another direction. That's the human way. And the important thing is to do the radical listening, right? When it's happening. That's the important thing. And so I think the thing that I've learned from doing this process is that I do want to, moving forward, I want to find a way to continue to make work that can that can also be radical listening, because that has changed my whole, I mean, I've been moving in that direction anyway, you know, as I've sort of presented, but that experience here, I've never felt so connected. And the irony of that is I've been in total isolation, and yet I've never felt more connected through the work to people than I have in this project. The weird irony of it all. So thank you. And thank you, Christina, of course, as you've noticed, she's been collaborating with me for years and years, and has been on this project too. One of the few people who actually has sung and sent in a testimony, although there are 4 or 5 people now who've done both. So, you know, yeah, thank you.
Well, Lisa, thank you so much for being here. We're super excited to be a part of this next chapter.
Me too.
Yeah. Any parting words?
No, just, you know, thank you for, you know, this is a long and detailed go through. So thanks for you know, coming along for the ride. Yeah.
Of course. Just a quick plug for zFestival's crowdfunding campaign. There's a few hours left to give to us to support our guest artists and our participants. So if you're here or on the YouTube, please consider giving. There should be a link in the YouTube chat. But otherwise, thank you so much, Lisa.
No, thank you.
We'll see you all on Wednesday.